From days long ago, you have to know we're talking Voltron.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. This episode is super cool. This was kind of a walk down memory lane for me because when I was like 10, 11, 12 years old, I was obsessed with Voltron. Let's just go ahead and jump right into it. My guests today are the co-host of the Let's Voltron podcast, the official Voltron podcast, Marc Morrell and Greg Tyler. Greg and Marc, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us on.
Obviously, since you're the co-hosts of the Let's Voltron podcast, we're going to talk about Voltron today. There are some things that kind of formed my childhood. You know, on this show, I give away my age all the time. So, but there are some things that inform my childhood, and it has to be Star Trek, Star Wars, Dungeons and Dragons, and Voltron.
Nice.
Those are some excellent choices.
Yes, those are awesome.
You know, maybe a little original Battlestar Galactica or Indiana Jones.
I'm okay with
or
that
something
too.
like that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
But Voltron, when it first came on, I can't really explain what it was. I was probably like 9, 10, or 11 or something like that when it was on. Right at the perfect age for it to hit.
Oh, yeah.
Really hope here today we can dive into some of the history and talk about some of the kind of almost the phenomenon that is Voltron. And
Sure.
So just to kind of set the stage a little bit, when did Voltron air, just for somebody who's not familiar with that?
Marc, you want to take that?
Yeah, I kind of wrote the book on this. I wrote a book called Voltron from Days of Long Ago, a 30th anniversary celebration. I did the introduction part that showed the development of how the show got started and how all of the subsequent shows came to be. So that's something that you might want to check out if you're really into Voltron. But yeah, the first date was September 10th, 1984 was when it first showed up on US airwaves.
Where did the show come from?
Within that, there were a bunch of people from a little production company in St. Louis. They were actually a KPLR, a little company that had broken off of KPLR Productions called World Events. World Events Productions became basically the IP owner of Voltron. So there was a group in St. Louis that wanted to have children's programming that could be syndicated. So they wanted to take some Japanese cartoons and they wanted to Americanize them for children in the United States. And so they had gone to a film festival and had taken a look at some of the stuff that they had there. And they went and ordered from a company called Toei Animation. They ordered some of their videotapes. And when they ordered them, they were looking for specific ones. And one of the ones that they got, which ended up being the real Voltron, was one called Beast King Go Lion. And when they had originally asked for the videotapes, they had said the one with the lion. And the one that they were really looking for was one called Daltanius. And the funny thing is they sent them Beast King Go Lion instead. And the cool thing about it was that you could watch Beast King Go Lion without knowing any Japanese and still follow the story. And they thought that they could, transform this into something that American audiences would like. So that's how it all got started. And they worked with a production company in Los Angeles. They got a team together. They had Peter Keefe and Jameson Brewer was the writer. And they got Franklin Kofod, who had actually worked on Americanizing the Gatchaman series into Battle of the Planet. So in doing all that, they put together a really good team, and they had to put a pilot together to be able to show this. And when they went to the conference that they were going to show this at, they had to set it up in stereo because they wanted it to be in stereo. That was one of the big things that they wanted. And the funny thing was that they set up the room that it was going to be in with all these people that they had brought in, and the stereo really blew people away. But they were able to sell the show to at least 65% of the market, which was to allow them to get syndication at a national level and national advertising as well. So all of that came about in probably less than a year. And it really came out as also they had 6 voice actors that were really good. Peter Cullen and Michael Bell and Neil Ross and B.J. Ward and Lenny Weinrib. Jack Angel. Yeah. So that whole list of voice actors really made this show powerful.
And another thing to keep in mind, I mean, what's the typical age range of your listeners? I'm just curious. Are they in our generation typically, or
kind of all over?
Okay, so to set this, to set the stage, in the early 1980s, there was a change in regulation among the federal government in the United States that allowed for weekday syndication of animated programming that didn't need to be educational in nature, and that opened the floodgates for independent stations all over the country to need new content, and animation was open season at that time, and so the pioneering series that kind of got the ball rolling was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, and it proved to be so successful that a number of production companies were looking for things to fill time slots in these largely UHF, but many VHF stations as well, and one of them was KPLR TV that Mark had mentioned in St. Louis, and it was for his own station as well as others that Voltron was brought into being, and it was designed to be a 125 episode package, so it could air without reruns for 25 5-day weeks. And Beast King Go Lion sadly didn't have enough episodes to cover 125 episodes. It only had 52. So they originally planned to loop in a couple other shows, one called Armored Fleet Die Rugger 15 and another called Lightspeed Electroid Albegus. That's once they got over the Daltanius to Go Lion debacle. Yeah. And it turned out that the Go Lion episodes, the Lion Force Voltron episodes, were so enormously popular, and it proved to be kind of difficult to adapt Armored Fleet Die Rugger 15 into the Vehicle Team Voltron episodes, that rather than pursue the Albegus episodes to fill the 20-odd episode gap left by adapting the 52-episode Go Lion and Die Rugger series, that they decided to produce all new. World Events Productions made another 20-odd episodes to fill that gap. So it was really a combination of factors, and Mark touched on the initial idea quite well there, but I just wanted to add a little bit of context that there were a lot of stations that needed a lot of content, a lot of time filled during weekday afternoons, and animation, thanks to He-Man, I have the power, helped to pave the way for Voltron.
Of course, I watched He-Man all the time as well when it was on. And just a little tidbit, I grew up in St. Louis. I'm still based here. Wow. I was watching Channel 11, as we called KPLR.
That's right.
Back in the day. That was like the kid channel, right? I mean, that had everything that we could watch on there. And I actually, at some point, found out, I don't know if it was I'm trying to remember if it was at the end credits or whatever, but I saw it said St. Louis, Missouri on something like that. And I remember turning around to my brother and saying, they make Voltron in St. Louis. And he was like, nobody makes any TV shows in St. Louis. It was like, what are you talking about? No TV shows are made in St. Louis. And so, but I just thought that was so cool that it was, made in my hometown.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty amazing where things come from sometimes. It's not just in LA and New York, although, LA obviously gets the lion's share, no pun intended, of a lot of production content. So, yeah.
And I know you guys talked about a lot of things there. So I did just want to kind of pull out a few things. You mentioned it was a very popular. How popular was the original Voltron series?
It was a #1 rated show for quite a while. It was at first, because He-Man had come out a year prior, that one was still the breadwinner there. But by the end of 84 and beginning of 85, Voltron had hit #1. So it spurred on a whole lot of merchandising. And the team that was working on Voltron was just, trying to, because it was a daily show, they just kept on trying to crank it out and crank it out and crank it out. And then all of a sudden, they realized that a whole bunch of companies wanted to make Voltron merchandise. So they started setting up all types of licenses and everything for Voltron. And at one point, and I remember Ted Koppler saying this quite clearly, he went into his toy store, I think it was FAO Schwartz, and he said that there were the Beast King Go Lion Voltron stuff, and then there was the actual Voltron stuff. And if you looked at the shelves, all the Voltron stuff, the Americanized Voltron stuff was gone, but the Japanese Beast King Go Lion stuff was still there. So things were selling out pretty good. Everybody wanted a Voltron. Everybody wanted that Matchbox Voltron. Everybody wanted a Castle of Lions and all the action figures. And I mean, there were a million products that came out after that. All kinds of things, from toothbrushes to cameras to pillows and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking here on an eBay listing for a lot of times people will cut pages out of magazines and sell them individually because they think people will buy them, and I guess they do. But one of them is a page from a television trade magazine, and it's a full page ad for Voltron from World Events Productions. They're promoting it in a television industry mag. And it says, #1, Voltron Defender of the Universe, the #1 new animated strip of the 84-85 season, #1 rating, children 2 to 11, #1 rating in households for children's entertainment. So it was big.
I mean, of course, I remember just being at school. What we all talked about was Voltron. I mean, even the kids who pretended they didn't watch Voltron watched Voltron. I mean, like, everybody was watching Voltron. What do you think it was about Voltron? Why was it so popular?
Greg, you want to take that one?
Well, I mean, I don't think anyone can give one definitive answer,
Sure.
but my personal take is that now I say this as someone who was also a huge fan of Transformers back in the day, but what I loved about Voltron, which was fairly unique, was that the humans were the heroes, and it was there working together in unison, working as one toward a common purpose to do the right thing. There was a sense of friendship and family across these people. Even in the cheesier episodes, you got that sense of togetherness, and I think that to me was a huge reason for its success. And I have to be, brutally honest and say the robot just looked really awesome too.
Yeah.
I mean, how many robots do you see with robot lion heads and hands and feet? It's just pretty crazy.
Yeah, I really think it was a lot had to do with that iconic theme that it had every time it formed Voltron.
Mm-hmm.
So whenever the lions came together to form Voltron, there was this iconic theme that was written by John Peterson. And it's just that combined with every time it takes on a road beast, pulls out all these different weapons, and then Blazing Sword comes out, it slices it in half and it explodes. So, I mean, and you get that almost every episode. So you really can't complain about that kind of stuff because it's just so cool.
Absolutely. I think it hit a lot of those things. It was, I think absolutely, Greg, that there were people, there were humans that you could identify with instead of kind of an object or the robot itself. So you could identify with the humans, and then they managed to touch on a lot of cool things. Swords, the lions turning into, the lions themselves are super cool. And then Voltron looked very cool when he formed. Yeah, it was really unlike anything that, we had been watching on TV.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah. You had mentioned the vehicle Voltron. Something for me that happened here, I still remember it. It was, I was watching Voltron all the time. I was adding new characters. I was making up new things. I was doing all kinds of this stuff that a kid, who's into role-playing games and all kinds of stuff would do. I remember a friend of mine was spending the night, and he was like, well, are we going to stay up and watch the other Voltron? And I was like, what do you mean? There's another Voltron. I had never heard of this. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he's like, well, it was a Friday night, but he was like, at 2 a.m., there's another Voltron that comes on. So we stayed up and we watched this other Voltron, but it was totally different. It involved vehicles, and there were no lions. And I did not understand what was going on. To this day, I don't even understand why you would put a kid's show on at 2 a.m., but there it was. And so you had mentioned that a little bit, and that was to try to fill out enough episodes for Voltron.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, the syndicated, you have to think about the fact that it was a contract, and when you've got to fill that number of episodes, and there's a point at which that's more important than the actual content. And I know that sounds silly, but it's business, right? I mean, why do so many animated programs have 65 episodes? Why are they multiples of 13? It all has to do with, how especially for daily strip stuff, 65 episodes lets you run the full series 4 times a year with no repeats. 13 weeks, 5 days a week. And 125 was a bigger number to commit to, but it let you air with fewer repeats in a year. You could air twice and change and cover 52 weeks with just showing the shows, twice and change each. And so that was a big sell. And another big sell was stereo, as Mark mentioned. It was very new, cutting edge stuff at that time. And so, at the time, no one thought Lion Voltron was going to be all that in a bag of chips. They thought, okay, here are 3 shows. We can adapt them, fit this 125 episode commitment with these 3 shows. It just turned out by sheer luck and the skill of the people adapting the show that Go Lion proved to be overwhelmingly more popular. Well, you've still got 70 odd episodes you've got to fill. So, you stick to the original game plan and adapt one of the other shows. And oh, by the way, everyone loves the Lions and we only have 20 more episodes to fulfill our contract. So let's make more Lion shows.
So they commissioned Toei to make 20 more episodes of the Lion Force series. And then they had a combined movie called Fleet of Doom where we had both the Vehicle Voltron and the Lion Force Voltron in the same movie. So there you go, 125.
Yep.
Yeah, I just don't have any memory of the Vehicle Voltron airing like in the after school time slot.
Yeah, I think it may have varied from market to market. I've heard of a variety of people recalling different things over the years. For me, in my market back in the day, it aired in the same time slot as the Lion stuff. So, the first season of Lion episodes aired and with a sprinkling of vehicle shows mixed in. And then when they had gone through the Lion episodes, they had the solid block of vehicle episodes. And then there was a period of reruns. And then the following fall in 85, the second batch, the smaller batch of Lion episodes aired. So they were all interleaved kind of sort of for me. How about you, Mark?
Yeah, well, it was 4:00 in the afternoon every day after school. So, there were times when we saw the Lion Force episodes and times when we saw Vehicle Voltron. Now, of course, they never got to do an Albagas or Albagas. They were originally planning the trilogy. And when the toys came out in the early 80s, it also included the Gladiator Voltron toys. And that was the only place where you heard that there was this actual trilogy. Because if you read the packaging of the Gladiator Voltron toys, it would talk about that. So it was Voltron from the near universe, Voltron from the middle universe, and Voltron from the far universe. So while they haven't ever done Albagas episodes for Voltron, we did just recently find out that there's a couple of episodes of Albagas that are available with subtitles out on the YouTube channel for Toei Animation. And we will be reviewing that on our next episode on the podcast.
Yeah, it should be a lot of fun. I think part of the fun will be to watch it and try to figure out how they might have adapted those episodes into Voltron if that had ever, taken place. Kind of impossible to be objective about that now because, it's 35 years later, but it'll be a fun mental exercise.
Right.
Yeah. Now, you had mentioned some of the names of some of the voice actors that were used. Those are some pretty famous names, even though some people might not recognize the names. Could you mention maybe a few of those names again and some of the other shows that they were involved in?
Peter Cullen was Optimus Prime on Transformers, both the animated and the live-action movies. So he's probably got the biggest name out of everybody. Although Jack Angel, at one point, he was one of the highest-grossing actors of all time. So he's been in so many things that were higher grossing because he's done voices in movies and stuff like that. He was in AI, the movie by Steven Spielberg, Artificial Intelligence.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, and he's been in a bunch of things. So at one point, he was listed as one of the highest grossing actors of all time. And then, of course, people like Neil Ross and Michael Bell and B.J. Ward, they've been in things like Transformers, G.I. Joe, a whole bunch of other things. And I think Neil Ross even was in the Back to the Future 2 as the narrator for the Biff Tannen Museum. So, I mean, there's just a wealth of things that these guys have done. Lenny Weinrib, of course, he did a bunch of things, but he passed away, what was it, in the early 2000s?
2006. Yeah, he was best known as H.R. Pufnstuf. So he was H.R. Pufnstuf. He also played Scrappy Doo. He was also Time Timer. What was it? You are what you eat, from your head down to your feet. Do you remember that in Saturday morning cartoons? And I think he was the Cookie Crisp Wizard and some of those ads. I mean, he was in so many things, in front of the camera and behind the camera. But all of them had such a diverse set of experiences. B.J. Ward is perhaps best known as having been Scarlet in G.I. Joe, A Real American Hero. Michael Bell. I mean, these people did everything, like Mark said. But Michael Bell was Duke in G.I. Joe, Prowl in Transformers. So many other characters, and yeah, they were all so talented. Neil Ross in the Transformer world was Springer and other characters. Shipwreck and G.I. Joe. Yeah, they were all very, very busy.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, and G.I. Joe is another cartoon I watched a lot of when I was.
Oh yeah, and knowing's half the battle.
The show didn't stay in the 80s, right? It has spawned a lot of things since then.
Yes.
So what was kind of after the 80s, what was the next time we got a Voltron show?
It was the late 90s. So it was Voltron, the Third Dimension. There were some similar voice actors for some of the roles, but then they had actually exchanged a couple of the voice actors with different ones. So for the role of Lotor, you got Tim Curry instead of Lenny Weinrib. And then for Pidge, you got...
Billy West,
right. I'm sorry.
And sounding very, very much like Fry from the later Futurama show.
Right. But Neil Ross still played Keith, and B.J. Ward still played Allura and Hagar.
Michael Bell was still Lance, and he also picked up Koran.
Right. And then there was another one. Zarkon was played by Kevin Michael Richardson instead of Jack Angel.
Yeah, and he also played Hunk.
Right.
Yeah, and I should point out really quickly that just before Voltron the Third Dimension, Voltron Defender of the Universe was repackaged for syndication in the 90s and is not well remembered even by people at World Events Productions today, but with a 3D CGI opening, they repackaged the Defender of the Universe episodes as the New Adventures of Voltron. So every now and then, if you hunt YouTube, you might find this intro for a show that you don't remember. And it was kind of a rough draft for the 3D CGI for the Third Dimension, which was cool. So the Third Dimension, why was it called that? Because at that time in the 90s, 3D CGI was all the rage. Yeah. Reboot and Transformers, Beast Wars, and Beast Machines, you name it. That was all that back then. And so just as World Events Productions was pioneering with stereo and animation in the 80s, motion capture was the big deal for the Third Dimension in the 90s, where rather than hand animating absolutely everything in the show, many of the characters were animated using motion capture, where you'd have actors on a soundstage with little, what look like ping pong balls stuck to their jumpsuits, and they would move around and cameras would capture the animation. And that's why the characters have a kind of an organic feel to how they move in the show, because their performances were captured from real people moving in real ways.
But doing CGI back in those days was very expensive, and the rendering was expensive, and it took a long time. So I think we only got 26 episodes out of that one.
Right.
I'm just surprised to actually hear that it was motion capture. I would have just thought it was 3D animation.
Yeah, and now the mouths were a different story. I mean, they didn't do motion capture of the mouths. In fact, if you look at the show, you can see several shortcuts that they took to make the show affordable to produce. Mm-hmm. Motion capture was one of the things they did to make it more affordable, but other things they did was hide their mouths whenever you possibly could. Helmets, you'll notice, look like lion heads, and the lower jaw very conveniently covers their mouths most of the time. And so you'll see them kind of nod their heads up and down, almost Power Ranger style, but not as exaggerated. But almost never, unless the camera's looking down on them from a severe angle, do you see their mouths moving. And there's a reason for that. The hair was very well gelled. So you wouldn't see the hair flopping around as they did. Right. They had helmet hair. Yeah.
And we had mentioned things like Hagar's robe wouldn't flow with the wind or anything like that.
Yeah. So there were definite shortcuts, but it was very, very pioneering, and it was entirely produced in the United States, which was another rare thing at that time.
Yeah, I wouldn't have probably believed that either. I was just wondering, I think I only ever got to see like one episode of The Third Dimension. I was just wondering, how was it received?
Not as well the original Voltron.
Certainly not. It's a lot of people think it have sort of described it as their least favorite of the Voltron shows. I think there's a lot to enjoy in the show. It is genuinely entertaining. If it is intended for the same demographic as the one that watched the original show, kids.
Yeah.
And for us who grew up on Defender of the Universe, we knew Zarkon was evil, but in the third dimension, it's sort of set up as that Zarkon has been reformed, and he's walking around with the leader of the Galaxy Garrison, who is now a robot.
Amalgamus.
Amalgamus, voiced by Neil Ross, by the way, to basically he's trying to spread peace and love throughout the universe. And we all know, doggone it, he's evil, don't believe him. But to a kid at that time, maybe that wouldn't have been so obvious. It's hard for us to be objective about it because we weren't kids then. But among the people who were kids in the 80s, the 90s shows generally was not as well received. But
there was a toy line from Trendmasters that came along with Voltron, the Third Dimension, that was pretty popular.
That's true. That's true. That company was similar to Playmates Toys in the sense that they were pit bulls with every property that they grabbed. They'd sink their teeth in and just would merchandise the heck out of it. So it's quite remarkable how much merchandise that one company made for that show.
And if they could only figure it out how not to have the paint chip while it's still sitting in the package, that would be great.
Yeah. There are many toys from that line. Now we've skipped over the some of the merchandise made back in the 80s, although as Mark said, it was very prolific. The amount of stuff was mind-boggling. But Trendmasters it made some really neat looking stuff. But the quality of some of the finishes and some of the plastic was a little less than desirable. I'm sure you may have heard of some of the Beast Force Transformer toys suffering from gold plastic syndrome, where certain parts with kind of a metallic sheen baked in kind of crumbled over the years. Well, the Trendmasters toys didn't have that problem, but they did have some of the plastic and some of the toys was very, very brittle and doesn't hold the test of time too well today.
Plus, the show introduced a lot of storylines that Voltron fans weren't used to. The fact that there was a prior relationship between King Alfor and Hagar, and also that the lions were sort of sentient and, they had their own thoughts and feelings and things like that. That hadn't been introduced before. And it took it in a different direction from the Roby standpoint, too. I mean, there was Dracotron, there was Stealth Voltron, there was a bunch of different things that hadn't been introduced in the previous Voltron.
And in a lot of ways, while some of that, it was very jarring to 80s fans at that time, the Third Dimension in a lot of ways did help to set the stage for some of the shows that followed, including the most recent one, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little while.
And then, then after the Third Dimension, there was another show, right?
Right. In 2011 on Nicktoons came Voltron Force.
And what was the premise behind that?
Well, the funny thing is even before that show came out, it had gone through a couple of versions, and having had the chance to get together with Jeremy Corey and people that were involved in that production, there was a set of images and stuff that we saw for Voltron Panthera Force. So that's one thing that a lot of people who saw Voltron Force didn't know, that it was originally going to be that. And people were probably shocked to find that it would have been more like the characters look more like panthers,
like the lions or the pilots.
The lions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it would have been a full reboot with all new characters. And at some point in development, it was decided that the original pilots would be retained. And so 3 of the 5 characters, the 3 that looked the most human, because a couple of them were alien, the 3 that looked the most human evolved into what became the cadets in Voltron Force. So part of that premise was that Voltron had been around for an untold number of centuries, and that it is sort of the torches pass from generation to generation. Okay. So as the pilots age out, they bring in new ones and train new pilots. And so in Voltron Force, the premise is that the 5 pilots that we all know and love, they're not old by any means, but they've been the pilots for a while, and they've welcomed 3 new cadets to begin to learn how to eventually transition and become new Voltron Force pilots, which is kind of cool.
Okay. For a second there, I thought there was like a mashup between like the Thundercats flying the lions or something. And I was thinking, well, it would be strange, but it'd be really cool.
Yeah.
So that would be something.
So we still had, the main cast of characters for that show. Okay, so we had Lance and Hunk and Pidge and Keith and Allura and Karan. We had the added benefit of having 3 cadets that were going to eventually take over roles as part of the Voltron force. But the nice thing about that show was the very first episode, the premiere episode, was the highest rated episode Nicktoons had ever had at that point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
So when it came out, I took notice right away. Greg, when did you first learn of it?
Oh, I learned of it before it aired, but not too long before it aired, because I was an active member of the old Voltron.com forums. I used to post as Dudley Droolwright, and there's a Voltron reason for that. But my original screen name was Galaxy Garrison, and a term dating all the way back to the 80s. So I learned about it from there, because I had not heard of Nicktoons. I was already, biologically anyway, grown up. But I thought, ooh, new Voltron, I'm going to watch it. And so I watched it from the very first day and just loved it. The premiere was a whole different, more upbeat tone than the Third Dimension was. The colors were very vivid. The designs were very new and different. The style was different. I was all in from moment one.
And the theme song was vastly different.
Oh yeah,
there were a lot of people that loved the theme song, and then there were people that hated the theme song because it was so much different from the original Voltron theme.
Yeah, they hired Swizz Beatz to make a hip hop theme, and I loved it because if each iteration of a property is identical to a prior iteration, then why bother? You know what I mean?
Right.
Yeah.
And Voltron Force breathed a lot of much needed new blood into the property, and I loved it.
And it was called Let's Voltron.
So well, there you go.
So of course we love it.
Yeah. I remember hearing about it coming out, and I think I only got to see about 3 episodes, but I did think it was quite interesting. It did have kind of this, I think you mentioned, Greg, this upbeat kind of feel and kind of positive kind of vibe to it, I guess. And now they also made some changes to some of the original kind of characters as well and introduced some new things too, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. One of the big changes that they did there, in addition to the cadets, was the fact that there was a Sky Marshal Wade character, and we got
kind of a corrupt. He was like a corrupt Starfleet admiral from Star Trek. He was in charge of the Galaxy Garrison. He had an axe to grind with Voltron, and he was just a mean, nasty dude.
And he was voiced by voice actor Gary Chalk, who's also a live action actor as well. Gary Chalk has just got that deep bellowing voice, and he was perfect for the role. And we got to interview Gary Chalk at RetroCon years later.
Yeah, he is most well known among animation fans for having voiced Optimus Primal in Beast Wars and Beast Machines.
Yeah, and then the other thing was, when Voltron was formed, at some point they found out that they could actually form Voltron with any line being the center. So it was because of the powers that the cadets had, and their Voltcom, which was another thing that was brand new to the show, was these Voltcoms that they wore. And it allowed them to have different powers, abilities, those types of things. So that it also affected Voltron whenever Voltron, and they could use their Voltcom powers to be able to make Voltron behave in different ways as well.
My favorite of the villains, in addition to the return of Lotor in Voltron Force, my favorite of the villains was Mayhawks, an entirely new character. He was kind of an occult scientist, an alien, very strange looking. He was sort of that show's version of Hagar, but he had his own motives, and by the end of the show's sadly one and only season, he proved to be the ultimate big bad of the show, and the final showdown between Mayhawks and Voltron was really, really fun to watch.
And they brought back characters from the previous Voltron versions that we loved, like Sven. And they also, I don't want to, well, what?
Just say it, Mark.
Well, okay. So when the cadets actually got to the point where they were ready to take over, the roles of the Voltron force, of course, there's only 3 cadets, so you can't get all the members of the Voltron force to be replaced. So who's going to stay in their lines as one of the older ones, and who's going to be replaced? So you kind of try to figure those things out as you're watching the show. And then at some point there was this thing called Hagarium that Mayhawks had somehow generated from Hagar somehow. And that was the power source of all evil. And somehow Daniel had gotten infected with it. And as a result, over time, he kind of turned evil.
Yeah, Daniel's one of the cadets. So we didn't mention their names, but the cadets are Daniel, Vince, and Larmina, who was a niece of Princess.
Yes. And how is Larmina the niece of Allura if Allura was an only child? So it's those types of things, that the producers never thought the fans would go crazy about.
I remember something, I don't know if it's true or not, but like I said, I was only able to catch a few episodes. Wasn't Pidge secretly a DJ?
Oh, he was more than a DJ.
Oh, okay. He was the DJ, right?
Oh, well, okay. So dating back to Go Lion, the anime that the Lion Force Defender of the Universe episodes were based on, the Pidge, the original character that became Pidge was known as Hiroshi Suzuishi, and his nickname Shorty. And at one point in that show, he jokes that he's from a planet of ninjas. Well, in Voltron Force, and in Voltron itself, the Pidge character became known as the smart guy. Uh-huh. And so Voltron Force comes along, and they made him his entire home planet. He's a human-looking guy from a planet called Balto, which was also established in the original Voltron. Uh-huh. But in Voltron Force, it was established that everyone on Voltron on the planet Balto is a ninja scientist.
Tech ninja scientists.
Yes, but wait, there's more. Yeah. And one of the episodes, not my favorite of the episodes, it was also established that he was secretly moonlighting as a DJ who had his own holographic techno band called Stereolactic. And so Pidge got a lot of stuff done on the side while he was working.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is that people like Hunk and Larmina were huge fans of Stereolactic.
And they didn't know.
And that was how Hunk was able to connect with Larmina at one point. Ah. But then the one episode they found out that he was this DJ and kind of things ended for his DJ career at that point.
Yeah, and I will say that, again, it's easy to laugh this stuff off, and it is funny in retrospect and even at the time, but it is not entirely dissimilar to the absolutely amazing brain power of Pidge in the newest iteration of the show. So, it might stretch credibility a little bit to say, okay, he's a Voltron pilot, he's a super smart technical guy, scientist guy, and a ninja, and a DJ, but Pidge has had a long legacy of being very intelligent.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, if you can be a scientist and a ninja, why not?
Absolutely, right. People go to the gym, right? I mean, or so I've heard.
Yeah. Well, that kind of leads us into the newest show of Voltron, which enjoyed quite a run compared to some of the other shows. Why don't we talk about the new one that aired on Netflix?
Sure, go for it, Mark.
All right. So in 2016, they debuted Voltron Legendary Defender. And the cool part about this is, and we kind of learned this early on, we kind of got the idea that it was contracted for 78 episodes. But every time they would come out with a new season, they wouldn't tell us, is it going to be another, 13 episodes? The funny thing was when this came out, we had gone to WonderCon, and WonderCon had the whole cast come out as a debut for the show. And it was great to meet everybody and to see everything that happened, how it came to be, how it was developed and everything. And I had been hearing secretly in the background, I had a friend who worked for Acid Free Gallery. He had actually gone to a trade show in Vegas. And at this point, they were introducing some of the new shows that were going to be happening out of DreamWorks. He got to see like a 5-minute clip of all these new things, and one of them was Voltron. So he sort of told me in the background, hey, don't say anything, but this is coming. And he was amazed by it. And the great thing about it was it sort of had the perfect everything. It had great producers that were coming from The Legend of Korra and Avatar: The Last Airbender. We're talking about Joaquim Dos Santos and Lauren Montgomery. And then it had this awesome cast, of voice actors like Josh Keaton and Kimberly Brooks, Rhys Darby, Jeremy Shada and Bexter Klaus. Wow, there's a whole bunch more. But
Tyler Labine,
yeah,
Neil Kaplan, Cree Summer, AJ LaCasio, so many amazing people.
Right, and then it had the premier voice director Andrea Romano. So you
story editor Tim Hedrick, just an amazing bunch of people.
Right, and then an amazing amount of animators that were coming from Studio Mir in South Korea. Put all that together, you've got the makings for an amazing show. And they had been working on this for 2.5 years prior to it actually being released. So for these voice actors coming out to WonderCon that first time, they're excited to have everybody see this for the first time. And because they've been holding onto this secret for over 1.5 years.
The original series, I watched it every day. I watched all the reruns, loved it. The other series, Third Dimension and Voltron Force, I was only able to see a few episodes. This one, I have watched every episode of this one.
All right.
All 78. Wow.
And, it helps now that I have kids. So I use an excuse to show it to my kids. It's just, I wanted to watch it, but I was like, I'll just show it to the kids. So I have seen all of these episodes. Now, they really took kind of some creative license, and it's really just a complete reimagining kind of the whole concept. Isn't that right?
Right.
Sure.
Right. So right off the bat, you see that what used to be the Sven character, Shirogane, was now the Shiro character in this one. And that basically this is there's actually, we're touching on Earth because there's an expedition from Earth that's on Pluto's moon, Kerberos, and then they get captured by the Galra, which was the original name of the bad guys in Beast King Go Lion. You notice right away that they're already using some things from Go Lion, some things from Voltron. They're mixing things around. They're altering things a little bit. And you follow along with it, and it becomes a great story.
Yeah, I mean, this was not typical Robeast of the Week fare that the original show often could be, where, you had it wasn't always the case, but there were many episodes where, Zarkon, Lotor, and Hagar would unleash their latest amazing Robeast that would totally destroy Voltron. Well, they launch it gets to the planet Eris and starts ripping everything up. The Lions get launched. They pick away at it a little bit with their weapons. They form Voltron. They fight a little bit more. They form the sword, slash, you're done. They win. That was a typical pattern. This was anything but. I mean, it was an ongoing story arc that spanned the 78 episodes. It was planned more or less from start to finish. Things did evolve at different stages in production and pre-production. But, it had a story with a definite beginning, middle, and end. And yes, it took some liberties with things, but the showrunners often commented, they were on our podcast numerous times, that they strove to make the characters pass the squint test. So if you looked at each of the characters and squinted, they would look just like they did in the 80s. Which was fun. Pidge was reimagined to be female, so you didn't have 4 guys and a girl like they did in the 80s and the other iterations. That was nice. I remember when they first announced the voice cast and Bex Taylor Klaus was announced as Pidge, I immediately thought, Pidge has got to be female. I sure hope so. And yes, that turned out to be true. And again, this is a reboot, so it's not like Pidge changed. This is a new iteration, and that was so really, really cool. Allura was given a very different appearance. Rather than being a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, Caucasian-looking female, she was redesigned to have she and her species, the Alteans, had elf-like pointed ears and markings on their faces, and Allura in particular had darker skin, which was nice to the characters in general had different ethnicities than they visually seemed to have in earlier versions, which was really nice.
Yeah, I thought that was a great touch, actually, and it really kind of brought some of the characters to life instead of just a cardboard cutout of a big guy and a little guy or something like this. It really added some extra dimensions to some of the characters.
Right.
What were some of your? I mean, you mentioned making Pidge female. What were maybe Mark? What was kind of your favorite addition?
So I really like the fact that they made Pidge female. I was happy that in the beginning you couldn't tell if there was any types of I guess, relationships between the characters or anything like that. In the old days, there had always been a suggestion that there was a Keith and a Laura type of thing going on. But in this one, it was pretty much up in the air. But that wasn't the premise of the show, really. The premise of the show was all about, teamwork, about the fact that 5 people who came together kind of haphazardly could form Voltron and defend the universe. Yeah. And that basically it could be any of us, because the best thing about this is that we could relate with any of the characters. There's people that related really well with Shiro. There was people that related really well with Pidge or Hunk or Lance or Keith. And this was one of the things that they said when they did their initial testing of the show. They wanted to find out who people's favorite characters were. And what ended up happening was they got an equal amount of favorites for all the different main characters. There were people that identified with, each of the characters in their own way. So if you ask who our favorite characters are from this one, go ahead, Greg. Who's your favorite character from Voltron Legendary Defender?
Hunk, easily.
Yeah, and mine is Pidge, with Shiro being a close second.
How about you?
I thought they did a great job with kind of all of them. If I had to pick, I might say, I don't know, it's tough. I really liked Lance. I really liked some of the stuff that they did with Lance.
There's no wrong answer to this question.
But I do love, I did really enjoy Keith as well. And Pidge was great, kind of a great take on Pidge. So if I was picking, I guess I would say Lance.
And my favorite animal was Cosmo.
I was just thinking too, one of my favorite kind of additions to the show, I guess, was the Bayards.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Which is interesting. Go ahead. I'd like to hear your thoughts on those.
Well, I just thought that was really cool. Anytime, I don't know what it is, if it's something in my psyche or whatever, whenever somebody gets like a special weapon like bestowed upon them, I just think that is like the coolest thing. And to have each of the paladins, as they're called in this one,
right.
Each of them to have their own kind of special weapon that then manifests itself as like a reflection of their personality. I just thought that was fantastic.
Yeah, and that's what's kind of fun is if you go back and look at the different iterations of Voltron, it's sort of there's sort of an evolution, whether it's intentional or not, with not just the Bayards but also things with the Lions. And the connections with the Lions in the original series. You get the sense that they're vaguely mystical, maybe kind of sort of, because Allura's father, Alfor, seemingly had created them, and his ghost appeared repeatedly throughout the series, which lent a sort of magical, mystical angle to the Lions, even though they never really overtly did anything that was magical. The third dimension comes along in the 1990s, and over time, the pilots of the Voltron Force formed telepathic connections with the Lions so that they can actually, in one episode at least, control them telepathically. In Voltron Force, the Lions have some level of sentience. They're bonded with their pilots. And the keys to the Lions that had been in the Defender of the Universe and the third dimension had now evolved into these gauntlets called Voltcoms, which gave them special weapons and let them unlock new abilities in Voltron. And then in Voltron Legendary Defender, the key concept, the Bayard, or the Voltcom concept, evolved into that Bayard, where again you had these custom weapons, and they could also unlock new capabilities in the Lions and Voltron. So it's kind of neat to see. You can sort of see a continuum of ideas there, which is really interesting.
How was that show received?
Voltron Legendary Defender was wildly popular when it came out. It also had something that the previous version of Voltron didn't have. So Voltron Force was the only show that didn't get a toy line. Oh. So it was originally thought that maybe Mattel would pick it up,
and they had a license to it,
right? And that there were even some prototypes and things like that we had seen that we were hoping that they would make it into characters and vehicles and all that kind of stuff. But it never came to be for Voltron Force. But they had immediately announced when Voltron Legendary Defender came out that there would be this line of toys by Playmates Toys. And Playmates was best well known for their, TMNT line, mm-hmm. and then even prior to that, to some of the Star Trek line. Do you remember any of those?
Certainly the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle ones. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so everybody...
And then the Star Trek ones. Yeah, of course. I think I still have a Worf in a box or in the package here somewhere. I need to put them out
so
and
many.
get a display of him somewhere.
I think I had hundreds of Star Trek action figures by that company. Oh man, I spent so much of my would-be college money on them.
Did you have the transporter room?
Oh gosh, yes. The bridge, the engine room. Oh yeah, it was great stuff.
Yeah. So when we got a chance, we actually had a chance when we were at New York Comic Con to go to a party where they were introducing all of the Voltron Collective, is what they were calling them.
Wow.
All these different brands that were going to be part of this Voltron Collective that were launching with the show. And Playmates Toys was one of them. What were some of the others? We had...
Han Cholo was around from the very beginning.
Right. Han Cholo, who did jewelry. I think they had Bait, who did some things.
Some shirts and hats.
Right. They had New Era hats. New Era Hats was going to be doing stuff. So there was a bunch of brands at the beginning. And when we went to this party, we actually got to see the original Voltron Legendary Defender Voltron. And it's an electronic Voltron. And it has the ability to have the 5 lines be separate. And then you combine them together into the giant Voltron. And it's a good, 14 inches high?
About 16, actually.
16 inches high. So when we saw that for the first time, we were pretty excited.
Yeah, they had the thing under like a cylinder, a plexiglass cylinder, and at roughly eye level. And we were walking around, Mark and I, and a number of people that we met, fellow fans that we met that night, and still maintain contact with us to this day. We were just walking around that thing in awe, like, wow. It was really amazing, and Voltron Legendary Defender really, I think it defied expectations of DreamWorks and became very popular among an older fan base than I think anyone expected. I think the teens and 20-somethings really latched onto the show.
Yeah, so you had people in their teens and early 20s that were huge fans of this show. Kids in college, kids in high school, and then, of course, all of us who were, big fans of the original Voltron. So you had all the older generation as well. So it really brought together those two generations, and it really made for a nice fan base. I can tell you just from looking at the numbers of when we were doing the podcast. Of course, we've been doing this podcast for 6.5 years, and we're almost to 200 episodes. This podcast, during the time that Voltron Legendary Defender was on, saw some outrageous numbers for listeners.
Oh, well, that's awesome. And I was going to then ask you about your podcast. So you are the co-host of the official Voltron podcast. That is, that is just too cool.
Well, I can tell you the story behind why it's the official. Can I tell you that?
Sure.
Because my first co-host was Jeremy Corey, who was the original creative director at World Events Productions.
Yeah, I've met Jeremy.
Yeah, so he's also been, a producer on the Voltron Force show, and he also wrote an episode, Ghost in the Lion. Yeah. So he worked with story editor Todd Garfield and worked with all the writers and everything to punch up that story for Voltron Force. Mm-hmm. And when Voltron Legendary Defender came out, he wasn't with the show anymore. So he had left World Events Productions after our second episode.
Wow.
So we started with him as the co-host because he was what made it official.
Yeah.
Because he was one of the people that worked for the IP owner. They allowed me to, of course, continue doing the show, and I picked up another co-host, Michael French, who is best known for Retro Blasting, which is a great YouTube channel. And then for a while there, I was on my own. And then along comes Greg. Greg had helped me do a couple of 2-part episodes, one for the Third Dimension and one for Vehicle Voltron. And after that, he had suggested that maybe he could join on as co-host. And of course, I accepted. And ever since then, he's been a wonderful co-host.
Well, thank you. I'm amazed he still tolerates me. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I joined in early 2016, so it's been about 4 years for me. But it's been great to be part of the podcast as a listener, as a guest, and then eventually as co-host. We've met. Mark and I only maybe a half dozen times to this point. We actually work out of different locations, so we've been social distancing from the very beginning. But it's been wonderful each time we get together, whether it's on the podcast, through Skype, which is our weapon of choice, or face to face when we've gone to some conventions. And Mark tends to go to many more than I do because he wears the Toon Barn hat as well. Tell them about Toon Barn.
Well, I've been writing ever since Voltron Force came out. Back in 2011, I was looking up information for Voltron Force, and I came across this site called Toon Barn. It's toonbarn.com, and it's a cartoon blog. It's an animation blog. So it said, do you want to write for Toon Barn? And then I got an idea. Hey, why don't I write Voltron Force episode reviews on the website? So I got in touch with them and got to know the editor-in-chief and everything, and they let me start writing episodes for Voltron. And that's how things got really rolling for this, because once I started writing episode reviews for Voltron Force, World Events Productions started taking notice. And then I was able to get like phone interviews and then eventually face-to-face interviews. After doing all that, that's when Jeremy got to know me, and that's when he suggested I could be the writer for the introduction for the Voltron book for the 30th anniversary. So all of that rolled together. And of course, doing things that I do for Toon Barn, I'm doing interviews at conventions like San Diego Comic-Con, New York Comic-Con, WonderCon. We've been to Emerald City Comic-Con. We've been to RetroCon, and I've been to Keystone Comic-Con, Philly Comic-Con. Wow, I've been to a lot of things.
You get around.
Yeah. And each time I go to those things, I'm getting interviews with voice actors, producers, directors, writers, character designers, all kinds of people in the industry that work for, things like Disney and DreamWorks and Warner Brothers and DC and all these types of things. And it's just amazing to get to know all these people, in that type of intimate setting. But you're only seeing them for a very short time, but you get to talk to them about all these really cool, either animated properties or franchises. Wow, I've probably done over 1,000 interviews with all that. But then Greg got to join me at WonderCon. He got to join me at New York Comic-Con. And we got to see some of these people together. And there's very few interviews that we have with the Voltron cast and everything, but the ones that we had together are some of my favorites.
I really thank you for sharing that story, because I find it interesting how a lot of times how people get involved in the things that they are involved in. So that's a lot of fun hearing that. Now on the podcast, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go ahead. I was just going to say very quickly, I learned about the podcast in large part due to Michael French. He was still co-host at the time, but he was doing double duty because his heart and soul was being poured into retro blasting, and still is. Excellent YouTube channel, as Mark said. And it was through knowing him on the Voltron.com forums. I believe he was posting at that time as Shirogane or something like that. And we got to know each other a little bit through there. And eventually, that led into my being a guest on the podcast. I don't remember all the little steps, but yeah, it's really interesting to hear. I love hearing these kinds of stories too. So every time Mark says it, I keep thinking, wow.
On the podcast, I was just going to say, you guys really dive deep into some of the history of the production and have some really fantastic interviews. So I definitely recommend anybody out there who even has a passing interest in Voltron should check out the podcast, because I know some of your guys' episodes just dive into some history that is really fascinating. That is just, and I know that's where I have learned some of the stuff that, I just never even heard of before when you guys were talking about some things on the podcast.
Yeah, one of the neat things that we were able to do through the podcast is be able to talk to people like Seth Green and his wife Claire Grant, who are huge Voltron fans. We've gotten to meet all the voice actors and the producers and the directors and the writers and all that. We've also been very excited to meet a lot of the Voltron fans out there, and Voltron fans come from all around the world. So we've actually been lucky enough to meet several people from other countries as well. So we've had, fans from the UK, fans from Australia, had fans from Japan. That we had a Japanese celebration of Voltron that we did because I met them at WonderCon. Greg, what do you think are some of our better shows when we do some of our stuff?
Well, first I want to say thank you so much for the kind words about the podcast. We are honored that you've listened to the podcast, and we're pleased to call you a friend and fellow Voltron fan. So thank you for your kind words. Yeah, but I think some of my favorite episodes, in addition to fan spotlights like Mark has touched on, where we've had fan artists and fan cosplayers and just friends that we've met through Voltron. We've had many repeat guests because we've gotten to know people, and our listeners have gotten to know people through the podcast, and that's always a treat. It's kind of like a family reunion when people come back on. But I think some of my favorite episodes have been episodes where we've talked with people who have worked in the animation industry in different eras when Voltron was produced, and hearing the stories about what they were doing in the animation industry at the time, how they got in, and learning the connections that they've had with so many legendary people. One of my favorite people that we chatted with was a gentleman named Stephen E. Gordon, who was a supervising producer on Voltron Force. And he told us a fascinating story about how he started as an animator for Rankin Bass as a high school student.
Wow.
Working on the Lord of the Rings animations. And, and you hear, and we've talked with Neil Ross, and he had worked with so many legendary people, and Jack Angel and Mike Young from Mike Young Productions in the 90s. Had so many connections, and those are some of my favorite podcasts that we've done.
Yeah, and I like when we got in with line producer Benjamin Kaltenecker for Voltron Legendary Defender.
Oh, yeah.
And he told the story of just basically soup to nuts how the show is made, which is amazing to hear when you go through the whole process. And then, of course, Andrea Romano, when she's talking about, how they take the script and how the voice actors, are recorded. And we actually got a chance to go to one of the voice studios in Burbank and watch Andrea Romano in action before she retired. So that was a special treat for both of us, and I will never forget that at all.
Oh, it was so amazing. We were sitting in the recording in the production side. We weren't in the booth with the voice actors, but the voice actors Jeremy Shada and Kimberly Brooks were there.
Yep.
And Andrea Romano was there. Joaquin Dos Santos and Lauren Montgomery were there with their scripts to help make sure everything was okay. There were a couple other people in the booth helping with the technical aspects. And just to be flies on the wall during that process was really neat. As I look back now, I think what they were actually recording were some of those vlogs that DreamWorks put out between seasons, where they had these little YouTube videos of each character coming on a camera and talking about their experiences as a paladin. And they were doing some retakes of some of that stuff. But it was just amazing to see that process in action.
Right.
I mean, I can only imagine. It sounds fantastic.
It was amazing. I had gotten the chance to interview Andrea Romano for many things that she did for Warner Brothers in DC several times before that. So I did know her, and she knew of me and all that. So I think that's why she didn't mind having us there. But they are very, very secretive. They have those non-disclosure agreements and everything that the actors have to sign. But they're very secretive of their episodes even. So that's probably why we didn't get a chance to hear them recording on an actual episode. But hearing them record anything at this point, if they were reading the dictionary, I didn't care.
Yeah.
And I'll form the schwa.
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, I mean, that is just absolutely amazing. Well, I've had you guys on the line here for a long time. Where can people listen to the podcast?
Well, we start out at letsvoltron.com. Okay. And if you have access to a web browser and everything, it's very easy to get to. We are also on Apple Podcasts, on Google Play, on Spotify, on Stitcher, and anywhere else podcasts are heard. You can listen to it on Alexa. If you go, Alexa, play Let's Voltron, the official Voltron podcast, you'll start getting the latest podcast.
Hopefully nobody's listening out loud right now.
Yes. We also...
Matt, well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mark.
We also created an Alexa skill.
Oh, wow.
So if you go on Alexa and you say, Alexa, open Let's Voltron, you'll get a randomized generator that will generate one of 75 different quotes that we had plugged into it. So
Awesome.
These are all things I created myself. So that's a special thing. We also have our YouTube channel, which is, Let's Voltron on YouTube. Mm-hmm. And then we have, of course, we have our Let's Voltron TeePublic store. So what we've done with a lot of our fan guests that we've had fan artists, we've had fan cosplayers and fan fiction writers and all that kind of stuff. But for the artists that we've had on, there were a few occasions where we had them make a special thing just for Let's Voltron and for the episode that they were going to be on. And then we would debut their new creation on our TeePublic store. So that's a special thing. You can still go to our TeePublic store and they have sales every so often where things are 30 to 35% off. So it's awesome. And then, of course, we are also on Twitter at Let's Voltron. We're on Facebook. We are on Instagram, Let's Voltron. So we're all out there everywhere.
And I have to say, on the subject of podcasts, Matt, thank you so much for allowing us to be guests on yours. And I have not yet had the privilege of listening to your podcast, but having been on here, you have been a very gracious host, and we clearly have some cool geeky stuff in common. I am very much looking forward to checking out more of your podcasts. So thank you again.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the kind words there, Greg. And I usually talk about tabletop role-playing games, Dungeons and Dragons. Predominantly Dungeons and Dragons, but I also like to broaden out and talk about geeky things. So I've had some really amazing guests as well on the podcast that you could check out. This is just a tangent. I'm sorry. If you like Voltron, you probably like 80s movies, right?
Oh, sure.
Do you like post-apocalyptic movies?
Yeah.
Some?
Yep.
Okay. Do you remember Patrick Swayze's Steel Dawn?
Yes.
Okay. I talked to the screenwriter. I interviewed the screenwriter on the podcast. Absolutely amazing. Do you remember the TV show Andromeda with Kevin Sorbo?
Yes.
Yeah. I talked to David Winning. He directed 10 episodes of that TV show.
Cool.
Of Andromeda and one episode of Stargate Atlantis and Earth Final Conflict going way back. He directed episodes of that.
Oh, yeah.
It has been a fun ride, but to put the focus back on you guys, I know, Mark, you mentioned letsvoltron.com and all of your social media. I will provide links to all of those in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So anybody who is listening to this podcast can head over to dicegeeks.com and they can check out the show notes page, and I will have links so everybody can listen to Let's Voltron podcast and check out your social media. So,
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And so, Marc and Greg, it was a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Thank you very much for having us.
Yes, thank you.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed my conversation with Marc and Greg today. It was just a ton of fun to be able to talk some Voltron. As I mentioned in the episode, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. I have linked to the Let's Voltron podcast as well as all of their social media. You want to check that out. You want to listen to Let's Voltron. If you have ever enjoyed an episode of Voltron, then you need to listen to the Let's Voltron podcast. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. You'll never miss an episode of this show. And every Friday, you will get an update on what I am working on and what is going on at Dice Geeks. Now, hey guys, if you like my podcast, if you're tuning in every Wednesday to listen to some of my awesome guests, then please consider supporting the show in some way. You can tell your friends about the show. You can leave a review wherever you're listening to your podcasts. You can also subscribe to the show, and you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Now, guys, I thank you so much for listening, and until next time, keep gaming.